We're talking all things dust collection, whether those big air cleaners actually do anything, and we're going to find out if installing permanent ducting is a total waste of time and money, because maybe there's a more efficient option. You have small noisy shop vacs and you have gigantosaurus dust collectors. Why do people use one for one thing and one for another? Can't I just use my 1-inch shop vac hose for my planer? Well, let me show you why that's not such a good idea by nearly asphyxiating myself. A shop vac seems very effective at collecting the smoke at first glance, but watch when I move the shop vac hose farther away from the source of smoke. It barely catches any of it after a few inches. If I held the shop vac hose close to my cutter head, it would actually be pretty effective at collecting dust at that one spot in the cutter head, but the shop vac is doing a whole lot of nothing anywhere else. And no, the dust chute is not really going to help much in this case and will likely clog up with chips because shop vacs don't have a lot of flow. We measure flow in cubic feet per minute, or CFM for short. Higher CFM is important because we need to move a large volume of air as quickly as possible to capture all the sawdust from our planer at all times. And this is why a dust collector is better than a shop vac for these applications. A dust collector is a shop vac on steroids because you can get them with CFM ratings as high as 20 times that of a shop vac, even for your small shop. You can see how much more effective the dust collector is at capturing smoke from much farther away when compared to the shop vac, which is great news for our planer because the high flow means that it will collect chips from the entire planer and not just one spot. But don't ditch the shop vac just yet. You can see that the shop vac doesn't seem to be as effective at first glance, while the dust collector was able to suck almost all of the smoke up from further away, because the flow of the dust collector is greater than the shop vac. But when I reduce a 4-inch dust collector hose down to a 1-inch shop vac fitting, we can visibly see a much slower airflow than simply using a shop vac. So why is this important? Well, as it turns out, we can't simply adapt the large dust collector hose for a smaller tool like a random orbit sander, since this drastic reduction in hose diameter causes the flow to drop to an unusable amount. But how do we know when to use a dust collector versus a shop vac? Luckily for us, the manufacturers of tools usually have this figured out and come with smaller connections for shop vacs on tools like random orbit sanders and larger connections for dust collectors on machines like planers and table saws. So unfortunately, to get it right, eventually you'll have to equip your shop with both a dust collector and a shop vac. Or there are a few new offerings on the block, including the Supercell from Oneida, that bridge the gap between dust collector and shop vac. Whatever wizardry goes on inside these, it allows you to go as large as a 4-inch port for a machine and as small as a 1-inch port for smaller tools and still get usable performance. However, you can spend top dollar on whatever dust collector you want, but with some tools, it might not make as big of an impact as you think. One of the biggest reasons why I upgraded from my old DeWalt sander to my Mirka sander was for the dust collection. Now, I know you might not be far enough along in your woodworking journey to justify spending top dollar on such a high-end tool, but random orbit sanders are one of the times where spending top dollar is actually worth it, because whatever the engineers designed into this sander, it simply picks up way more dust than my old DeWalt one when using the same extractor. So not only is this great for your lungs, since sanders are one of the worst culprits for the ultra-fine sawdust that's most harmful to breathe, but good dust extraction leaves a better result on your workpiece, and it keeps your sandpaper lasting longer too. This is my table saw, which is a 25-year-old clone of the ubiquitous Delta Unisaw. And the extent of the dust collection design in these saws is a hole cut in the side of the cabinet a solid 2 feet away from the blade where all the sawdust is being created. And not only that, but there are holes and orifices everywhere in the saw, and all of that just limits the amount of airflow that's near the blade. The dust collector that I was using for years, it's just so small, it doesn't have enough power to suck up all the sawdust from a machine where dust collection was basically considered an afterthought. I've been using the term shop vac rather loosely until now. Shop vac is a brand, and as the name implies, they make vacuums for your shop that are relatively inexpensive. The fact that shop vac is a brand name is superfluous, since most people call any vacuums from other brands, like Rigid, shop vacs as well. There is a heightened version of a shop vac that you may have heard before, and it's commonly called a dust extractor, not to be confused with a dust collector. At first glance, they seem to act very similar to a shop vac and are used for the same application, so why do you see so many dust extractors in YouTube land wood shops as opposed to shop vacs? Well, there are a few subtle differences between the two, and I'll start with maybe a not so subtle one. The price. You can get a decent shop vac for under $100, whereas dust extractors, they start at maybe 6 times the price of a shop vac. Well, that's a bit of a negative, but the good thing is that you will get higher performance. I looked up a bunch of data on shop vacs and extractors, and it seems that you'll get more power in a smaller package with extractors, because you'll get just about 2 times the CFM in comparison to a similarly sized shop vac. You can get larger and more powerful shop vacs too, but I don't necessarily trust their numbers, as they claim to be more powerful than a smart car on a good day. Vacuums are loud in general, but dust extractors are definitely a bit lower in volume compared to those noisy shop vacs, with a caveat. Many extractors now have a built-in auto clean function, and that's designed to clean the filter during use so the flow doesn't drop as much. I've heard the 3M dust extractor before, and that kind of sounds like a machine gun going off every 30 seconds. And the Bosch kind of sounds like a cannon firing. So every time I turn it on, I have to press this little red button to disable the auto clean every single time, because I don't like being frightened when I'm using a tool like the miter saw. Maybe I'm a little jumpy. I think all dust extractors come with a plug for automatically starting and stopping the vacuum when you plug a tool into it. There are better shop vacs that also have this, but the cheaper ones definitely don't. And you can also add one on a separate unit, but I think if that's your goal, you should just buy a vacuum with this feature already in it. If you're starting out, get an inexpensive shop vac, and that'll do you until you're able to upgrade to a dust extractor. The laws of diminishing returns definitely apply here, because you're going to get 80% of the way there with a shop vac for very little money, and you'll have to spend a lot more money to get anything noticeably better. As an aside, you need to use a filter bag with a dust extractor. This keeps the other internal filter clean and the flow flowing. You can get away without using a bag with a shop vac, but the cylindrical filter can get gummed up pretty fast, and then performance will drop. The downside is that for both types of machines, these bags are painfully expensive, and it hurts when you fill one up really fast. Enter the cyclone separator. You hook this baby up in between your tool and your vacuum, and magically most of the dust ends up falling into the bucket and doesn't go in your vacuum, saving you multitudes of expensive bags for your shop vac or extractor. They're pretty inexpensive themselves, and they'll earn their keep in no time. The standard size works great, but it is a little tall to fit underneath a tool or cabinet, so Oneida makes a more compact version of the Dust Deputy that fits neatly under my miter saw station to stay dedicated to this dust extractor. Similarly to the smaller units, there are bigger cyclones that you can add to dust collectors that don't already have them. However, there is a bit of a catch with all of these cyclones. When you add anything in between your dust collector and your machine, like adding a cyclone, it introduces resistance, which causes the airflow to drop. So, should we avoid cyclones in favor of better performance? As it turns out, we see this better performance when the filters in the dust collector or in the shop vac are brand new. But as you use these machines without a cyclone, the filters are exposed to all of the dust that it sucks up, and therefore the flow of air through the filters will decline much faster as they get dirty. However, with a cyclone, even though it causes an initial drop in CFM due to more resistance, over time the filters will actually stay cleaner for longer, since most of the dust doesn't reach the filters and therefore doesn't clog them up. Overall, adding a cyclone does improve the performance when looking at the entire picture. Adding a cyclone to a regular bagged dust collector can be a bit of a project and will certainly take time and money, so it's up for you to decide if it's going to be worth it. Otherwise, simply upgrade to a unit that already has a cyclone. For my old dust collector, I could have spent the money on upgrading the canvas bag filter to a new pleated HEPA filter, and I could have added a cyclone separator, but I went a different route instead. So I started my relationship with Oneida with a bit of a lie. I told him my shop was slightly bigger than it actually was, and that I was sure that the V-System 3000 with Smart Boost would actually fit in my shop no problem. But the reality is that I wasn't sure at all, since my ceiling height is a mere 78 inches, and the website said a minimum height of 84 inches was required. I have this thing where I secretly think I know better than more experienced people, which usually comes back to bite me. And even though Oneida's website said it wouldn't fit, I thought, They can't tell me what I can't do. The wall mount was assembled with a couple of bolts and it came with a handy dandy template. My issue is that my walls are strapping on top of cinder block and the 2x2s were not in the exact spot I needed them to be, and I don't think the dust collector would remain on the wall very long if it was only screwed into a 2x2 at any rate. I cut open the drywall just enough to fit some milled down construction lumber that would sit flush with the drywall once it was secured to the cinder block. Then I could reattach the template, mark for the rest of the screws, and drill straight through the blocking into the cinder block where I could then screw these long tapcons. And that way the dust collector bracket squeezes the blocking right tight to the cinder block, so this thing is not going anywhere. Now that I have permanently altered my shop, I can start assembling the dust collector and see if it'll actually fit or find out if it was all for nothing. It starts with a lot of this fun foam tape to make sure that there's a good seal between all the components. Next, I can mount the fan housing to the cyclone. And now because of my low ceiling issues, I can't actually assemble it in the way Oneida wants me to, because when it's up and on the wall bracket, there won't be any room to get the motor and fan assembly up and over and down into the fan housing. So I'm gonna have to lift this sucker up all in one piece. Yeah, that's not gonna work. But what does work is calling for backup. This is Rahim, and he kindly came to my rescue and helped me lift it up and on the wall mount. Rahim has a YouTube channel called RV Woodworks, link is in the description, and go ahead and send him some love since I would be still waiting for help if it wasn't for him. So far, the dust collector seemingly fits height-wise, but I had a sudden horrible realization that I might not be able to move the dust bin in between the filter and my miter saw station to empty it. It seemed like it was gonna work, but it was gonna be very close. Seems like it would have been better off just getting a smaller dust collector, and in hindsight, it probably would have been totally fine to go with a lighter Oneida offering like the Mini Gorilla. But I'm also in a phase where I'm sick of upgrading machines, and I wanted a dust collector that would last me a lifetime, so I was determined to make it fit, even if the outlook didn't really look good. This is the Dust Sentry, which involves a light and a sensor, and that'll tell me when the drum is full so I can't procrastinate emptying it, unless somehow I can normalize this nuclear meltdown alarm light flashing crazy bright in my shop. This is the moment where I found out if this is gonna... Yes, it's gonna work. And that makes me happy and all the stress worth it. And I've also conquered my height restrictions and I was able to fit the whole dust collector under a short ceiling. I attached some ground cables to make sure static charges wouldn't become an issue. I attached both the dust sentry light and the start switch onto the wall bracket, and I wired up a twist lock plug. We have a dust collector. Now what? Well, I need to connect my dust collector to my tools, obviously. And there's two ways that we can go about doing this. The hard way or the lazy way, and the lazy way might actually be superior. The lazy way being running a flex hose from your dust collector to your machine and then moving the hose from tool to tool as you need to. Now this is supposedly inferior to permanently installing piping or ductwork throughout your shop, and at face value it does kind of make sense. Flex hose is a bendable corrugated pipe, and it's this rough surface that causes internal turbulence, therefore reducing your CFM. So for the sake of performance and also convenience, everyone from old experienced folks to overly regurgitating Googlers always recommend permanently installing a network of ducting from your dust collector to your machines. When you install permanent ducting, the pipes are very smooth and they only cause the airflow to decrease by a small amount in comparison to flex hose. But try as you might, you can't connect all your tools to your dust collector using only straight pipe. We need fittings to snake our pipe to every tool in our shop, and it's these fittings that cause the biggest problems. You may have heard that it's better to use two 45-degree elbows like this instead of using one 90-degree elbow. And this sounds good in theory, but in reality, it's a bit of a generalization, and here's why. When airflow changes direction within the ductwork by traveling through a fitting, the resistance will increase because of added turbulence and friction. This resistance will reduce our airflow, which is not what we want. While there are several things about fittings that affect the final outcome of airflow, the important one is the radius of the curve. If a fitting has a large and more sweeping radius, it has less resistance and therefore causes a smaller drop in airflow, which is what we want. People suggest that using two 45s instead of a single 90 has an approximately greater radius curve when compared to this one. but the reality is that simply crossing your eyes and trying to see a larger radius doesn't actually make it a larger radius in the real world. So when it comes down to it, if you have two really tight 45s, each with a tiny radius, it'll have a greater resistance when compared to a simple 90-degree elbow with a large sweeping radius. The problem is that for some ducting options like PVC sewer pipe, we can't pick and choose what the radius of the elbows are. And depending on how small your shop is, the amount of flex hose that it would take to go from your dust collector to all your tools can actually have less total resistance than a permanently installed ducting system when you total up all the resistance from the pipe and fittings. Luckily for you, later in the video, I may or may not be testing this out. Speaking of sewer pipe, it's common to use PVC for ducting. You can easily find this at your local home center, and it seems relatively inexpensive. Well, not exactly. For 4-inch material, the prices seem pretty decent, but if your dust collector requires larger ducting, then PVC fittings can add up really fast. But the other, more relevant con for PVC is the elbow fittings have a brutally small radius, meaning that these curves are very tight and will cause a more noticeable performance loss when compared to other ducting options, and this is why I opted for steel snap-together ducting. Now, this is not the 30-gauge stuff that you can find at the home center. Unfortunately, that is a little too thin for a dust collector with a high static pressure, or in other words, the pipe would just collapse. Oneida supplied me with their 26-gauge snap-together ducting, and while this being their most economical option, it's more than strong enough to handle a small workshop dust collector. That being said, if you do want something a little bit more robust because you like chucking things around in your shop, then spiral ducting will be a step up in terms of handling abuse. The fittings are the same for either option, but the straight pipe will run you about 50% more expensive. If money is no object, there are quick connect ducting systems that will run you into the quadruple digits. The elbows and fittings are much smoother than the ones that I'm using, and there are no seams along the length of straight pipe, both of which cause less turbulence in the ducting. They look super easy to install too, but wow, they are expensive. It's likely cheaper just to get a bigger and more powerful dust collector than that type of ducting, but you do you. What size of piping should you go with? The easy answer is to go as large as the outlet is on your dust collector and then step down the diameter as close to your machine as possible. The long answer is quite complicated, so instead of me botching the explanation, I'll refer you to a video made by my buddy, Blake Pisey. He's a mechanical engineer with some experience in industrial HVAC, and he has a great way of calculating exactly what you need to maximize performance. Also, go bug him to make a video, because he hasn't in a while and he had promise. Dust collection companies like Oneida also offer your ducting design as a service if it all just seems a little too much for you. Oneida gives you diagrams of exactly how to assemble everything to take out the guesswork. And speaking of which, let me show you how I installed my ductwork. Now right off the bat, I'm going to do a faux pas and immediately start the duct run with an elbow off the dust collector. The rule of thumb is to have at least 3 pipe diameters worth of straight pipe into the dust collector before any other fitting. Since my duct is 6 inches in diameter, I should have 18 inches of straight pipe here, but I didn't want to block my French cleat wall with the ducting, so I had to compromise. I 3D printed these ceiling hangers to help me hang the ducting by myself. I'm not actually sure if they help me much in the end, but the final result at least looks a lot better than the typical metal strapping, and I was able to get the ducting snug to the ceiling, which is important for my painfully low ceilings. They have this cool print-in-place hinge that gives a satisfying snap to release it from when it was printed. I'll leave a link below to my site where you can download the STL files if you want them. Turns out after all that, the ducting was still going to impede the French cleat wall, so I had to take it down temporarily, and later on I'll put it back up maybe a few inches lower. In the beginning, I tried to cut all these straight ducting to length with a jigsaw and a metal cutting blade, but this was a bit violent and I struggled to get a straight cut without it binding and pinching and then wrinkling the steel. So I switched to a cutoff disc on my angle grinder, and I was able to make much faster and cleaner cuts. This is the wall mount version of the ducting hanger, which I'll also include on my website in a 4 and 6 inch holder. I designed them to use a single M3 socket cap screw into a captured hex nut, which did work okay when the hex nut didn't pop out. For the most part, my ducting is 6 inches and reduces down to 4 inches at the blast gate. This keeps the static pressure in the pipe lower for a better overall airflow. The transition between the blast gate and the machine is done with flex hose, which allows me to move the tool around a bit if I need to. Securing the flex hose with these band clamps makes it quick and easy. Not to lose any performance, I have to seal every transition between fittings and straight pipe to prevent leaks. Most of this I did with that aluminum foil tape, but I did have to use silicone where tape wouldn't work, like on the blast gates. And speaking of blast gates, I haven't really covered them yet in this video. You can't simply plumb all your machines to your dust collector and let her rip and expect to get good performance. You need to direct the flow to your dust collector with blast gates. There are a few kinds of blast gates, and I used to use these inexpensive plastic ones, but they tend to get jammed up with sawdust and then they don't really close all the way. That's why I switched to these metal ones, which should hold up better over time. For the deep-pocketed viewers, there are automatic blast gates that are motorized and automatically sense when you turn your tool on, and then they automatically open the blast gate, and then they automatically turn your dust collector on. It's really cool. But once again, you gotta pay to play. A very small number of people who have watched my DIY dust collection automation video might be wondering whatever happened to that system. Well, after I moved, I was so exhausted from renovating this garage and moving my tools and setting them all up that I didn't really care to rewire that system. The automatic sensing and blast gates, they all worked flawlessly, but there were a couple things I wanted to change and it all just seemed like too much work. And while it was really cool, it's really not worth the time to put into it unless you're super passionate about it. And I mean, I guess I've just become a passionless potato of a woodworker. After installing all of my ductwork, I could finally test out whether or not it was worth it to go through all of that hassle of installing it, when I could have just ran flex hose from my dust collector to all of my tools. Because if you remember, my theory suggested that I just wasted a whole bunch of time. The only small hiccup is that I couldn't actually do this test with my new dust collector because of the really cool new feature called Smart Boost. The Smart Boost feature is interesting because it's essentially a 3-phase motor with a single-phase variable frequency drive. It's programmed to detect changes in static pressure so that it can adjust the CFM accordingly. That all sounds a little bit complicated, but what it means for you is that when you step down the piping to, let's say, a smaller flex hose, like on a stationary sander, for example, the speed doesn't decrease like you saw before earlier in the video when I tested that out with my old dust collector. So unfortunately, I can't test the impact of flex hose versus ducting because any changes in the resistance, well, the Smart Boost feature is going to change the motor speed and nullify my results. Luckily, I didn't get rid of my old little 1 horsepower dust collector just yet, and I proceeded to set up an entire new ducting system with old 4-inch PVC pipe that I've been hoarding for I don't know why. I measured around 4,720 feet per minute, which translates to 411 CFM. This setup is nearly identical to the one I installed from Oneida with the same length and the same number and the same type of fittings, and so I still believe it's a real-world representation of a ducting setup in a small home hobbyist workshop. I use my same old dust collector and I use 17 feet of flex hose, which is more than enough to reach all the machines in my small workshop, and I measured 5,062 feet per minute or 442 CFM, which is 7% better. Even if the results were the same, the argument that a ducted network for dust collection is more efficient than just running flex hose everywhere in a small shop is totally invalid. And if you're that concerned about performance, you can take the cost savings from not setting up a ducting system and put it towards a more powerful dust collector. However, this test was done with PVC sewer pipe, and like I said earlier in the video, it's likely the worst option for ducting in terms of how much resistance these fittings have. The results may have been more equal to flex hose with steel ducting and fittings. Additionally, like I also said before, the result will also change depending on how large your shop is, because it's likely better just to go with installed ductwork if your shop is larger than a 2 or 3 car garage. And there's also something to be said about the convenience of simply opening up a blast gate rather than not having to sling around a large hose wherever you go, which ultimately might be worth the price of admission, but there are a few products that make slinging around a flex hose easier. If you forego the ductwork, then do yourself a favor and spend a little bit of your savings on a quality flex hose. One that actually does flex, because from experience, some of them should be called like slightly less than rigid hose. Also, invest in some sort of quick attach system like the quick locks that Izzy Swan came up with. Luckily, he passed the torch on to MagSwitch, who are now making them in a yellow flavor, and these allow you to take your hose from tool to tool but still connect it with a very easy to use but secure connection. I'll leave a link below where you can check these out. It's quite common to have a big air filter hung up from the ceiling in a shop, and it does make sense at first glance. Your dust collector or extractor mightn't be very useful for things like a handheld router or just simply hand sanding. So you fire that thing up on the ceiling and watch the air clear. Or does it? Well, I kept my big ol' air filter because I knew I wanted to do this video at least a year ago. I also set off another smoke bomb that felt like the equivalent to sucking on 5 smokes at once.
You don't even smoke, Bubbles.
Give me a smoke hairdo.
The smoke seemed to vaguely waft towards the air filter, but it certainly wasn't in a hurry. It hung around in the air long after the smoke stopped coming. This is the reason why those big box filters aren't as effective as we think, because they kind of just push dust around instead of actually removing it. Not to mention, these things are just big and in the way, especially in a small home hobbyist shop like mine. It's always better to try and collect the dust closer to the source. Using a smaller filter and fan closer to where the action is happening is much more effective. All the smoke is captured before it's able to just hang out in the air, and it really comes down to the proximity of the fan to the work. Oneida makes small benchtop units like these, but if you have the time, you can also make something similar using a box fan and a furnace filter. At the end of the day, you can spend a lot of time and money on all of this equipment, but sometimes the best protection is simply a respirator. So get one that fits well for those situations where no amount of dust collector or shop vac or air filter is going to protect you. I'll leave a couple links down below to some that I like. All right, folks, I gotta say, I am super impressed with the Oneida V-System 3000 with Smart Boost. The first time I turned it on, I'll be honest, my butt puckered a little bit because I was not mentally prepared for the extreme difference between my old little 1 horsepower thing compared to this 3 horsepower monster. When I first powered this up, I thought something was really wrong because I heard this crazy high-pitched squealing sound emanating from somewhere. Well, it turns out it was just a small leak that I missed sealing in the ducting, but the noise that it made was just a testament to how frigging powerful this whole system is. Anyway, full transparency, Oneida did send me the dust collector and ducting in exchange for this video, so big thanks to them. And if you're looking for a top-notch dust collector that can handle anything you throw at it, check out all of Oneida's offerings. Well, I made it through an entire dust collection video without making any suck puns. Now, my shop kind of looks like a cyclone hit it.